Rain lashed against the glass panes of the sunroom, a relentless percussion that mirrored the restless beat in Franklin Maddox's chest. 3 days. 3 days this mahogany chessboard had held his attention, a silent battlefield where he warred with himself. 3 days, and the stalemate remained unbroken. He picked up the white queen, its cool weight a stark contrast to the simmering frustration beneath his skin. Boredom, that insidious enemy of the affluent, had sunk its claws deep. The sprawling Westport estate, the meticulously manicured lawns, the echoing silence of rooms filled with expensive emptiness, they offered no solace. He was surrounded by everything money could buy, yet starved for something it couldn't. He replaced the queen with a sigh, the click of ivory against wood echoing the hollowness within him. What was the point? Another business deal, another acquisition? It all felt like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic of his life. He glanced out at the gray expanse of his property. The rain blurred the edges of the meticulously sculpted hedges, softening their rigid lines. It was in this softened landscape that he saw a flash of color, a bright yellow raincoat hurrying across the courtyard. Denise, his housekeeper, on her way to collect her daughter from the bus stop. The girl, Ammani, was a quiet, almost spectral presence. He'd barely exchanged a dozen words with her in the 2 years Denise had worked for him. A flicker of an idea, fragile as a newborn butterfly, stirred within him. It was a ridiculous notion, born of sheer desperation, yet it clung to him with surprising tenacity. He pressed the intercom button, the small action a monumental shift in the inertia of his day. "Denise," he said, his voice a little rough from disuse. "Your daughter, she's here today, right? Would she like to play a game of chess?" He held his breath, surprised by a sudden nervousness. What she said no. The thought, absurd as it seemed, sparked an unexpected pang of disappointment. The faint crackle of static on the intercom felt like an eternity. Then came Denise's voice, hesitant and laced with polite confusion. "Mr. Maddox? Ammani play chess with you, sir." He could almost see the gears turning in her mind, trying to decipher his motives. He pushed down the irrational urge to retract the offer. "Yes, if she'd like to. I find myself in need of a worthy opponent." He winced inwardly. Opponent. Such a loaded word for a child. "I'll ask her, sir." "Thank you." The click of the intercom disconnecting left him suspended in a strange anticipation. He looked at the chessboard, the stagnant pieces suddenly imbued with new potential. He was offering more than a game. He was offering a connection, however tenuous. He was offering an escape, however brief, from the prison of his own making. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the glass as he waited. Minutes stretched, each one a small increment on the scale of his growing impatience. He began to regret his impulsive invitation, the possibility of rejection a surprisingly bitter pill. Perhaps Denise had advised her daughter against it. He chided himself for even entertaining the thought. What possible harm could come from a game of chess? A soft knock at the door startled him. He rose, his heart beating a little faster than usual. When he opened the door, Denise stood there, Ammani beside her. The girl was smaller than he remembered, her bright yellow raincoat engulfing her slight frame. Her dark eyes, wide and intelligent, held a quiet intensity that belied her age. She clutched a small, worn book in her hands, its pages dog-eared and spine cracked. He realized with a jolt it was a chess manual. "Ammani, Mr. Maddox has very kindly invited you to play chess with him," Denise said, her voice carefully neutral. He could sense her apprehension, the subtle protectiveness of a mother shielding her child from the unknown. Ammani looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Mr. Maddox," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello, Ammani," he replied, forcing a warmth he didn't quite feel into his voice. Come in. Don't let the rain soak you any further." He stepped aside, gesturing them into the sunroom. The room, usually a haven of quiet solitude, suddenly felt charged with an unfamiliar energy. As Ammani shed her raincoat, revealing a simple blue dress beneath, Franklin watched her, a curious mixture of anticipation and unease churning within him. He pulled out a chair for her, his movements stiff and awkward. She sat down, her small hands folded in her lap, the chess manual still clutched between her fingers. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like an overgrown, clumsy giant in her presence. "So," he began, trying to sound casual, "have you played much chess?" The question sounded inane the moment it left his lips. The worn chess manual in her hands was answer enough. Ammani's gaze, steady and direct, met his. "Yes, sir." Her voice, though quiet, held a surprising firmness. "Good, good," he mumbled, feeling a flush creep up his neck. He gestured to the board. "White or black?" "Black, please," she replied, her gaze fixed on the board. He could see the subtle flicker of her eyes as she assessed the pieces, already strategizing, calculating. He moved his white pawn 2 spaces forward, the familiar click of ivory against which strangely amplified in the charged silence of the room. The game began, a silent dance of strategy and intuition unfolding between them. As the game progressed, Franklin found himself increasingly surprised by Ammani's skill. Her moves were precise, calculated, each one carrying the weight of careful consideration. She played with a quiet intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration, her small fingers hovering over the pieces before making her move. He realized, with a growing sense of unease, that she was not just playing. She was dissecting, analyzing, and systematically dismantling his strategy. He, on the other hand, played with a detached amusement, his mind wandering between moves. He found himself observing her, this quiet, enigmatic child who was slowly, methodically outmaneuvering him. He saw the subtle twitch of her lips when she made a particularly clever move, the faint crease between her brows when he presented a challenge. He saw the unwavering focus in her eyes, the quiet determination that radiated from her small frame. Hours melted away, unnoticed, as the game reached its crescendo. The rain outside had subsided, leaving behind a washed, clean world glistening in the late afternoon light. Franklin, now fully engaged, felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He was on the defensive, his king cornered, his options dwindling. He looked at Ammani, her expression calm and composed, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he was about to lose. And then it happened. Checkmate. Ammani's queen, poised like a silent assassin, delivered the final blow. The click of the piece against the board resonated with the finality of a gunshot. Franklin stared at the board, a strange mix of admiration and humiliation swirling within him. He had been thoroughly, undeniably, outplayed by an 11-year-old girl. Rain lashed against the expansive windows of Franklin Maddox's study, a percussive rhythm against the hushed elegance of the room. Mahogany shelves, laden with leather-bound volumes, lined the walls, exuding an air of intellectual prowess that Franklin himself often felt he didn't deserve. He gestured towards the antique chessboard set upon a small table bathed in the warm glow of a Tiffany lamp. The pieces, carved ivory and ebony, seemed to gleam with an almost sentient anticipation. He'd never truly appreciated them, viewing the game as a quaint relic of a bygone era. Now, an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation resonated within him. Ammani stood hesitantly at the threshold, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. Her dark eyes, wide and observant, took in the surroundings with a quiet intensity that belied her age. Franklin observed her reticence, a flicker of unease touching his own composure. Was this some sort of cruel amusement, pitting his world-weariness against the innocence of a child? The thought prickled, unexpected and unwelcome. He pushed it aside, offering a reassuring smile. "Come in, Ammani. Don't be afraid. It's just a game." Ammani stepped into the room, her movements cautious, almost tentative, as if testing the very air around her. The polished wood floor gleamed under her worn sneakers, a stark contrast that mirrored the chasm between their worlds. She glanced at the chessboard, her expression unreadable. Franklin wondered what thoughts flitted behind those dark eyes, What world she constructed within the confines of her young mind. He pulled out a chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. "Have a seat." She perched on the edge of the chair, her small hands folded in her lap. The rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, the sound a constant backdrop to the unspoken tension in the room. Franklin felt an odd pressure in his chest, a strange mix of impatience and something else he couldn't quite name. Expectation, perhaps? He began explaining the rules, though he suspected she knew them far better than he. Still, the ritual felt necessary, a bridge over the awkward silence. Ammani listened intently, her gaze fixed on the board as if deciphering secrets hidden within the squares. Franklin found himself drawn to her quiet focus, a stark contrast to the superficial interactions that filled his days. He was struck by a curious thought, a fleeting notion that perhaps he, the jaded businessman, had more to learn from this child than she from him. The game commenced. Franklin, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to winning, opened with the king's pawn. A predictable, safe move. Ammani responded in kind. The familiar opening moves proceeded with a deceptive tranquility, the clicking of the pieces against the board the only sound in the room besides the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Then, Ammani made her move. C5, the Sicilian defense. A flicker of surprise, sharp and unexpected, shot through Franklin. This wasn't the tentative play he'd anticipated. This was a calculated gambit, a bold declaration of intent. He studied the board, a furrow forming in his brow. The Sicilian, a complex, aggressive opening, favored by grandmasters. Not the expected repertoire of an 11-year-old. C5, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked up, meeting her unwavering gaze. "You've been reading UVE, studied this." A faint blush colored Ammani's cheeks. "A little," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Online at the library, just practice." Her words were simple, almost dismissive, yet Franklin sensed a deeper current beneath the surface, a quiet pride masked by humility. Franklin considered her response. The library, just practice. He pictured Ammani, small and solitary, hunched over a computer screen in the public library, absorbing the intricacies of the game, honing her skills in snatched moments between homework and whatever other responsibilities weighed upon her young shoulders. A wave of something akin to shame washed over him. He, with his private tutors and endless resources, had never truly appreciated the gift of learning, the sheer tenacity required to pursue a passion in the face of what? He hadn't even considered what obstacles she might face. He returned his attention to the board, the pieces now imbued with a new significance. The game was no longer a mere pastime. It was a battlefield of intellect, a testament to Ammani's resilience and her raw, undeniable talent. He felt a strange shift within himself, a stirring of something he hadn't felt in years. Respect, admiration, perhaps even a touch of envy. He played his next move with newfound focus, the casual arrogance replaced by a genuine desire to challenge her, to see the extent of her capabilities. As the game progressed, Franklin found himself increasingly impressed by Ammani's strategic thinking, her ability to anticipate his moves, to lay traps with the patience of a seasoned hunter. She played with a quiet intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration, her small fingers hovering over the pieces before making her move with deliberate precision. Each click of the pieces against the board resonated with a new meaning, a silent conversation between two minds engaged in a battle of wits. The rain continued to fall, the rhythmic drumming now a soothing counterpoint to the intense concentration within the room. The study, once a symbol of his solitary existence, now felt charged with an unexpected energy, a vibrancy he hadn't realized he craved. Hours melted away, unnoticed. The game stretched on, a complex dance of strategy and counter-strategy. Franklin, the jaded businessman, was lost in the world of knights and bishops, pawns and queens, a world where intellect reigned supreme, where the only currency was skill and strategy. He found himself captivated not just by the game, but by the girl across from him, the quiet warrior who challenged his assumptions, who forced him to confront his own complacency. The game concluded late in the afternoon. The final move, a checkmate delivered by Ammani with quiet precision, left Franklin staring at the board in stunned silence. He felt a strange mix of emotions, admiration, humility, and a flicker of something akin to hope. Later that evening, the rain having finally subsided, Denise sat at her small kitchen table in their modest apartment, her hands clasped around a mug of lukewarm tea. Ammani, perched on a stool beside her, recounted the events of the afternoon with an unusual animation. Denise listened intently, her heart a mixture of pride and apprehension. Mr. Maddox's interest in Ammani's chess skills was both a blessing and a potential source of heartbreak. She'd seen too many fleeting promises in her life, too many glimmers of hope extinguished by the harsh realities of their circumstances. Ammani, sensing her mother's unease, reached out and took her hand. "He said he wants to help me, Mama. He said he wants to find me a coach, maybe even tournaments." Denise looked at her daughter, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. She wanted to believe, she desperately wanted to believe that this time would be different. But the world had taught her to be cautious, to guard her heart against the inevitable disappointments. She squeezed Ammani's hand, her voice soft but firm. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." The unspoken question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their shared hopes and fears. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of the city, seemed to amplify the silence in their small apartment, a silence pregnant with the possibility of a future both exhilarating and terrifyingly uncertain. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany of Franklin Maddox's study. Dust motes danced in the golden rays, illuminating the rich leather bindings of books he'd never read, trophies he'd barely earned, and the chessboard set between himself and the small, quiet girl. He'd expected a light diversion, a patronizing display of his moderate skills against a child. Instead, Ammani Coington, all of 11 years old, sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the board with an unnerving intensity. He shifted in his chair, the plush leather suddenly uncomfortable. The silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock he'd inherited and never bothered to wind, felt oppressive. He could practically hear the blood rushing in his own ears. Underscore, why am I so nervous? Underscore, her hand hovered over a knight, small and brown against the ivory. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as another charity case Denise, his housekeeper, had brought to his attention. Another stray kitten needing a warm hearth, or in this case, a hefty donation to some after-school program. He'd almost refused, his boredom a heavy cloak he couldn't seem to shed. Underscore, what was I thinking? Playing chess with a child? This is ridiculous. Underscore, but something in Denise's quiet plea, a flicker of desperate hope in her usually placid eyes, had swayed him. Now regret gnawed at him, not because he was losing, but because he was losing badly. Ammani's knight moved, a swift, decisive action that forked his king and queen. He stared at the board, the elegant simplicity of her attack a stark contrast to his own convoluted strategy. His carefully constructed defenses crumbled like sandcastles against the tide. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat mirroring the arid landscape of his own life. Success, wealth, influence, none of it mattered in this quiet battle of wits. He was exposed, his weaknesses laid bare on 64 squares. "Checkmate," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. It echoed in the cavernous study, a pronouncement of his intellectual defeat. He looked up at her, expecting a triumphant smirk, a childish gleam of victory. Instead, her expression remained unchanged, her dark eyes still fixed on the board as if deciphering some ancient code. He felt a strange pang, not of resentment, but of fascination. He leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him, a sound that amplified the hollowness he felt. "You're remarkably good," he admitted, the words heavy with a sincerity he hadn't intended. He ran a hand through his silvering hair, the gesture betraying a weariness that went beyond the game. Ammani finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with a steady, unnerving directness. "It's like math," she said, her voice still quiet. yet carrying an unexpected weight. But with stories, every move tells you what kind of person they are. Her words hung in the air, a simple observation that resonated with a surprising depth. He stared at her, the afternoon light catching the subtle intelligence in her eyes. Underscore every move tells you what kind of person they are. Underscore the phrase looped in his mind, a quiet indictment. What did his moves say about him? His aggressive opening, a desperate attempt to assert dominance. His subsequent defensive maneuvers, a reflection of his inherent insecurity. His final, blundering moves, a testament to his lack of foresight. He had played the game as he lived his life impulsively, defensively, without a clear vision. He looked at the board again, the pieces scattered like fallen soldiers on a battlefield. He saw not just a game, but a mirror reflecting his own flawed character. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He'd built his life on a foundation of superficial achievements, chasing fleeting pleasures, ignoring the deeper currents of meaning and purpose. He'd been so focused on the outward appearance of success that he'd neglected the inner landscape of his own soul. Later that evening, after Ammani and Denise had left, Franklin found himself pacing the length of his sunroom, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the sprawling estate. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking display of natural beauty that he'd barely noticed before. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of Westport twinkling in the gathering darkness. He thought of Ammani, her quiet intensity, her insightful words. He thought of Denise, her quiet strength, her unwavering devotion to her daughter. He thought of the stark contrast between their modest apartment and his opulent estate, a physical manifestation of the chasm that separated their worlds. A wave of shame washed over him, a bitter acknowledgement of his own privileged blindness. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid sloshing in a crystal glass. He took a sip, the familiar burn failing to numb the growing unease within him. Underscore every move tells you what kind of person they are. Underscore Ammani's words echoed in his mind, a persistent reminder of his own shortcomings. He set the glass down, the clink against the marble countertop sharp in the sudden quiet. He knew he had to do something, not just for Ammani, but for himself. He needed to change the narrative, to rewrite the story of his own life. He picked up his phone, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat of his own restless energy. He dialed Denise's number, the ringing tone a fragile bridge between two worlds. He knew he couldn't erase the disparities, couldn't magically level the playing field. But he could offer Ammani a chance to nurture her extraordinary talent, a chance to escape the limitations of her circumstances. He could make a different kind of move, a move that spoke not of arrogance or indifference, but of genuine concern, of a desire to make a real difference, however small. As Denise's hesitant voice answered, he took a deep breath, the first breath of what felt like a new beginning. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope, a spark of purpose igniting within him. He had a new game to play, and this time, he intended to play it differently. The afternoon sun, filtered through the leaded glass of the sunroom, cast elongated shadows across the chessboard. Franklin Maddox, a man accustomed to winning, felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He repositioned a knight, the cool, smooth ivory a stark contrast to the restless heat in his palms. He'd switched to the Sicilian defense this time, hoping to unsettle the preternatural calm of the young girl seated opposite him. Ammani Coington, all of 11 years old, regarded the board with an unnerving stillness. Her dark eyes, framed by long lashes, seemed to absorb the patterns of the pieces, calculating, dissecting. He'd expected a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of the intimidation any child should feel facing a man of his stature in a house like this. But there was nothing, only that unnerving, unwavering focus. She's different, he thought, the realization prickling him with a strange mixture of annoyance and fascination. He'd played chess with business magnates, renowned strategists, even a grandmaster once, but none had possessed this quiet intensity. He moved his queen, a subtle feint, a test. Ammani's fingers hovered over a pawn, the slightest tremor betraying the workings of her young mind. She sees it, Franklin realized, a grudging admiration creeping in. She sees the trap, but instead of falling for the obvious gambit, she countered with a move so unexpected, so audacious, it forced him to reassess the entire board. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that suddenly seemed to amplify the tension in the room. He had underestimated her. Badly. He studied her face, searching for a crack in her composure, a hint of the effort it must take to maintain such a focused strategy. But there was nothing, just the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the quiet concentration etched on her smooth brow. He wondered, with a sudden pang of something akin to curiosity, what went on behind those watchful eyes. What was the world like, viewed from the perspective of an 11-year-old chess prodigy? The second game ended as swiftly and decisively as the first, though this time it was Franklin who offered his hand in resignation. "Well played, Ammani," he said, the words tasting strange on his tongue. He was accustomed to victory, to the thrill of outmaneuvering his opponents. This unfamiliar feeling, this respect for a child, unsettled him. Ammani's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox." Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it held a quiet strength that resonated in the stillness of the room. He watched her as she carefully reset the pieces, her small hands moving with practiced ease. An uncomfortable question, one he hadn't anticipated, formed in his mind. "So," he began, the casualness of his tone a thin veil over his genuine curiosity. "Do you play at school? Are there clubs, tournaments?" Ammani paused, her fingers stilled on a black bishop. The slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, spoke volumes. "Not really," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the board. "There's a chess club, but—" She trailed off, as if reluctant to continue. Franklin waited, a strange tension coiling in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that the unspoken words held a significance that transcended the game. "Budget stuff," Ammani finally said, her voice barely audible. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. "Tournaments, they cost money. And my mom works a lot. It's hard." The simplicity of her words, the stark reality they conveyed, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He sat back in his leather chair, the plushness suddenly feeling obscene, the opulence of the room a stark contrast to the quiet desperation in her voice. "Budget stuff. He spent more on a single bottle of wine than this child's family probably made in a month." The realization, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the carefully constructed walls of his privileged existence. How could I be so blind? He thought, the question echoing in the vast emptiness of his opulent study. He, Franklin Maddox, a man who prided himself on his strategic thinking, his ability to see the bigger picture, had been completely oblivious to the reality that existed just beyond the manicured lawns of his estate. He'd seen Denise, Ammani's mother, as just another member of the staff, a silent, efficient presence who kept his house running smoothly. He'd never considered her life outside these walls, the struggles she faced, the sacrifices she made. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir within him, a disquiet that had nothing to do with the lost chess games. It was a sense of responsibility, a prickle of conscience he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Ammani, really looked at her, and saw not just a gifted chess player, but a child with extraordinary potential trapped in a web of circumstances she couldn't control. The casual boredom he'd felt just hours ago now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a growing unease, a nagging sense of obligation. He cleared his throat, the silence in the room suddenly heavy with unspoken words. "Ammani," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to help." The words hung in the air, a promise and a challenge. He didn't know exactly how, not yet. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised even himself, that he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He owed it to her, to himself, to break free from the gilded cage of his own apathy and do something meaningful. The shift within him, subtle yet profound, marked the beginning of something new, something that promised to change both their lives forever. He would ensure that this remarkable girl, this quiet warrior with the soul of a strategist, would have the chance to reach her full potential, to shine as brightly as she deserved. He had a feeling it would be a more rewarding game than any he'd ever played before. The lingering scent of Earl Grey still hung in the sunroom air, a ghostly reminder of the small figure who had occupied the chair opposite him just an hour ago. Franklin Maddox swirled the remaining ice in his glass, the clinking a brittle sound in the otherwise silent room. The setting sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany floor, the golden light catching the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet to the unease that prickled at the edges of his consciousness. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years. Not since he could remember. Usually, his evenings were a carefully orchestrated symphony of predictable routines, a bulwark against the encroaching silence of his sprawling estate. But tonight, the silence was different. It thrummed with the phantom echoes of a child's quiet intensity, the click of chess pieces against the polished rosewood board, the rustle of her dress as she moved. He pushed himself out of the wicker chair, the familiar creak a jarring sound in the gathering dusk. The chessboard still sat on the low table, the pieces arranged precisely as they had been at the end of their final game. He stared down at it, a frown etching itself between his brows. He dismissed her initial win as beginner's luck, the kind of fluke that sometimes happened when an experienced player underestimated their opponent. But the second, the third, even the fourth, those weren't flukes. There was a precision, a strategic depth to her play that belied her age. It was unsettling, this quiet mastery emanating from an 11-year-old girl. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he crossed the sunroom and entered his study. The room was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, the air thick with the scent of old books and aged whiskey. He moved towards the sleek, obsidian laptop that sat on his massive desk, the screen reflecting his own troubled face back at him. His fingers, long and slender, hovered over the keyboard before he began inputting the moves of their games into a powerful chess engine. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Confirmation, perhaps? A need to quantify what he'd already witnessed, to translate the intangible feeling of unease into concrete data. The computer hummed softly, processing the information. Franklin paced the room, his thoughts a tangled mess. What had he expected? To find flaws in her game, childish mistakes that would explain away her wins? He wasn't sure. Part of him, the part that clung to the familiar order of his world, wanted to dismiss it all as an anomaly. But a deeper, more unsettling part of him knew better. He stopped pacing and stood before the laptop, the screen illuminating the growing tension in his face. The computer rated her play at nearly expert level. The synthesized voice of the chess engine announced, breaking the silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Franklin stared at the screen, the numbers and evaluations blurring before his eyes. Expert level. An 11-year-old. He thought of the chess clubs he'd frequented in his youth, the hushed reverence surrounding the grandmasters, the years of dedicated practice it took to achieve that level of proficiency. And this girl who lived under his own roof, practically invisible, possessed that same raw talent, that same potential for greatness. He sank into his leather chair, the soft groan of the leather a counterpoint to the turmoil brewing inside him. He ran a hand over his face, the smooth, cool leather of the chair a stark contrast to the heat that was building in his chest. It wasn't simply admiration he felt. It was something more complex, a mixture of awe, guilt, and a dawning understanding. He'd seen her, of course, Denise's quiet daughter, a shadow flitting through the halls of his house. He'd acknowledged her presence, offered a perfunctory nod, but he hadn't truly seen her. He hadn't seen the potential, the fire that burned beneath her quiet exterior. He'd been blind, not just to her talent, but to the inherent unfairness of her situation. He spent the next hour lost in thought, the silence of the study broken only by the occasional tap of his fingers against the desk. He scrolled through online chess forums, his mind racing. Tournaments, scholarships, coaching, the possibilities stretched before him, a labyrinth of opportunity. He thought of the resources he had at his disposal, the connections he could leverage. He should do something. This wasn't charity, he told himself. It was an investment in raw talent, in potential, in a future that shone with the brilliance of a young girl's mind. Later that evening, he found himself standing outside the small apartment above the detached garage where Denise and Ammani lived. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. He'd never been inside before. He'd barely exchanged more than a few words with Denise outside of their employer-employee relationship. He felt a sudden pang of guilt, a sharp awareness of the invisible wall that had separated their lives for so long. He took a deep breath and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Denise opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. Maddox?" she stammered, clutching her robe tighter around her. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but spotlessly clean. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of something cooking. Ammani sat at a small table, hunched over a chessboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He cleared his throat, feeling suddenly awkward and out of place. "Denise," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual, "I need to talk to you about Ammani." He paused, searching for the right words. He wanted to be delicate, to avoid shattering the fragile equilibrium of their lives. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to be anything less than honest. "I believe," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "that your daughter has an extraordinary gift. A gift that deserves to be nurtured, to be given a chance to flourish." Denise stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Ammani remained silent, her eyes fixed on him, as if searching for something hidden beneath his words. He saw the flicker of hope in her gaze, the subtle yearning for something more. And in that moment, Franklin Maddox knew that he wouldn't just be changing Ammani's life, he would be changing his own. The morning light, crisp and sharp, sliced through the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Franklin poured himself a coffee, the aroma a bitter comfort in the cavernous silence of his estate. His mind, usually occupied with the intricate dance of financial markets, was replaying the previous evening's games with Ammani. He found himself unnerved, not by defeat, but by the quiet intensity of the girl's focus, the unsettling maturity in her strategy. It was as if she saw the board, not as 64 squares, but as a battlefield of infinite possibilities. He felt a strange compulsion, a pull towards nurturing that raw talent, a feeling utterly foreign to a man accustomed to calculating risks and rewards. He glanced towards the pantry where Denise, Ammani's mother and his housekeeper, was meticulously organizing shelves. A flicker of hesitation danced in his eyes. How to approach this? He wasn't used to navigating the delicate terrain of human connection, especially when it involved something so personal. Denise noticed his lingering presence. A slight tension tightened her shoulders, her hands pausing mid-range on a jar of marmalade. "Mr. Maddox, is there something you need?" "Good morning, Denise. He stammered, the words feeling clumsy in the air. "I like to talk with both of you when you're free. With Ammani as well." Denise's brow furrowed. "Did she do something wrong, sir?" Her voice was soft, yet laced with a protective edge. He saw the instantaneous fear in her eyes, the reflex of a mother shielding her child. "No, not at all," Franklin reassured, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just please, I'd like to speak with you both." He retreated to his study, the polished mahogany desk seeming more imposing than usual. The chessboard, still set up from their last game, felt like a silent witness. He ran a hand through his hair, a wave of unfamiliar anxiety washing over him. Was he doing the right thing? Was this just another fleeting whim of a bored man? Later that morning, Denise knocked hesitantly on his study door, Ammani trailing silently behind her. The girl's eyes, large and dark, held a quiet observation, a depth that belied her age. Denise clutched Ammani's hand, a silent reassurance in the face of the unknown. Franklin gestured for them to sit. He struggled to find the right words, the usual fluency of his business negotiations failing him. He cleared his throat, the silence stretching taut. "I watched Ammani play last night," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. Her talent is remarkable." Denise's face softened, a flicker of pride mingling with apprehension. Ammani remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the chessboard. He saw a small scuff on her shoe, a tiny detail that whispered volumes about their circumstances. A sudden, sharp pang of guilt pierced through his usual detachment. He was a man who dealt in millions. Yet here, in the face of this quiet child's potential, he felt a profound inadequacy. "I'd like to cover private coaching for Ammani," he offered, the words hanging in the air. He watched Denise's face carefully, searching for a reaction. She didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion clouding her expression. He knew what she was thinking. Charity. A handout. He felt an unexpected sting of shame. He had to rephrase, to bridge the divide that his wealth had created. "I believe in her strongly," he continued, his voice gaining conviction. "It's not a gift. It's an investment in her future." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The tension didn't completely dissipate, but a crack of possibility appeared. He pressed on, explaining his vision, sketching out a plan that involved renowned chess tutors, tournament entries, and the nurturing of Ammani's extraordinary gift. Denise's initial hesitation slowly gave way to cautious hope. We had her tested when she was 6, she revealed, her voice a hushed confession. The school psychologist, she said Ammani was bright, but not exceptional. The words hung heavy in the air, a testament to overlooked potential, to the subtle ways that societal barriers could stifle brilliance. Franklin felt a knot tighten in his chest. "And the tests?" he prompted, his voice barely above a whisper. Denise's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tracing the lines on her worn palms. "We couldn't afford the proper assessments," she admitted, the shame evident in her tone. "The free ones, they weren't thorough." A wave of anger washed over Franklin, not at Denise, but at the system, at the inherent injustices that had almost robbed the world of Ammani's talent. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness towards this quiet child, a resolve hardening within him. He wouldn't let this opportunity slip away. He would ensure that Ammani received the recognition and support she deserved. He spent the remainder of the morning discussing the details, navigating the delicate balance between offering support and respecting Denise's pride. He saw the gradual thawing in Ammani's demeanor, a subtle spark of interest flickering in her dark eyes. The conversation moved from the sterile formality of his study to the warmer, more intimate setting of the kitchen. Over mugs of tea, they discussed not just chess, but Ammani's dreams, her aspirations beyond the 64 squares. He learned about her fascination with astronomy, her quiet love of books, the small, precious details that painted a portrait of a child yearning for more than her circumstances allowed. Leaving their small apartment later that afternoon, Franklin felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The city, usually a blur of indifferent faces, seemed vibrant, alive with possibility. He looked up at the sky, the same sky Ammani observed with such fascination, and felt a surge of optimism, a renewed sense of purpose. He had found something worthwhile to invest in, something more valuable than any stock or bond. He had found a future, not just for Ammani, but perhaps for himself as well. The silence in his car, usually a testament to his solitude, now felt different, charged with a quiet anticipation. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, a journey fraught with challenges and uncertainties, but he was ready to face them, driven by the unwavering belief in the quiet girl with the extraordinary gift. Sunlight, filtered through the leaded glass of the sunroom, cast geometric patterns across the polished mahogany chessboard. Dust motes danced in the golden rays, a silent ballet playing out against the backdrop of Franklin's opulent study. He watched Ammani, her small hands hovering over the pieces, brow furrowed in concentration. It had been a week since their first encounter, a week filled with these increasingly intense training sessions. He'd initially envisioned a casual mentorship, a fleeting distraction from the monotonous rhythm of his life. But Ammani's raw talent, the way she absorbed complex strategies with an almost unnerving ease, had captivated him. A strange, unfamiliar sense of purpose began to stir within him, a feeling so foreign he almost recoiled from it. This child, she's extraordinary, he thought, the realization echoing in the cavernous silence of his study. But am I capable of nurturing that? Of notenting it? Ammani moved her knight, a decisive, almost aggressive maneuver. He countered, his own move carefully calculated, yet feeling oddly predictable. Her silence throughout their games unnerved him. It wasn't the shyness of a child intimidated by her surroundings. It was something more profound, a quiet intensity that spoke of an inner world far richer than he'd initially perceived. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps a touch of awe in the face of his wealth and influence. Instead, he was met with this unsettling calmness, a subtle resistance that pricked at his carefully constructed composure. 3 games, 3 losses. He was playing against a child and losing. Not just losing, being outmaneuvered, strategically dismantled. The sting of defeat was strangely invigorating. It chipped away at the layers of apathy that had settled over him, revealing a flicker of something. Was it admiration? Envy? Or perhaps a reflection of his own untapped potential, staring back at him through the eyes of an 11-year-old girl? He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. Impressive, Ammani. You're learning quickly. The words felt hollow, inadequate. He wanted to say more, to understand the intricate workings of her mind, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Ammani finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with a disconcerting directness. Can I ask you something? Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it held a weight that belied her age. He nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. Her gaze flickered towards the doorway, where her mother, Denise, hovered anxiously. Denise, his housekeeper, her presence a constant reminder of the invisible barriers that separated him from the girl he was so inexplicably drawn to. Ammani's next words confirmed his suspicions. She doesn't look up. You always ask, I want to learn. I want to get better, but I don't want it if it makes my mom uncomfortable. She doesn't want people thinking we need saving. The air in the room thickened, heavy with unspoken anxieties and carefully concealed resentments. Franklin felt a wave of shame wash over him. He'd approached this entire situation with the self-satisfied benevolence of a savior, blind to the subtle nuances of their dynamic. He saw the pride in Denise's eyes, the quiet dignity that radiated from her even in her subservient role. He saw the way Ammani mirrored that same quiet strength, a protective barrier against the pitying glances and condescending smiles of a world that underestimated them. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his own privilege pressing down on him. You're right, he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I've been treating this like a rescue mission. That's not what it should be. Later that evening, the silence of his vast estate felt oppressive. He found himself pacing the length of his study, the image of Ammani's focused gaze imprinted on his mind. A rescue mission, the thought echoed in his mind, a stark indictment of his own misguided intentions. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass, but the familiar burn brought no comfort. He was restless, driven by a need to rectify the situation, to bridge the chasm he'd inadvertently created. He thought of the chessboard, the intricate dance of strategy and intellect, and the way Ammani navigated its complexities with such effortless grace. He had to do better. He needed to do better. He found himself standing outside Ammani's apartment building, a modest brick structure in a quiet neighborhood miles away from the manicured lawns and gated mansions of his own world. He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty creeping in. What am I doing here? He wondered, the question hanging heavy in the night air. He knocked, the sound sharp against the quiet backdrop. Denise opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. He could see Ammani sitting at the kitchen table, a worn chessboard set up before her, the pieces bathed in the warm glow of a single lamp. He swallowed, pushing past the lump in his throat. "I wanted to apologize," he began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I understand if you don't want my help, but I want you to know that I admire Ammani's talent. I want to support her, not as a charity case, but as a partner." He met Denise's gaze, holding her eyes with a sincerity he hadn't realized he possessed. "I can help her find the best coaches, enter tournaments, access resources she wouldn't otherwise have. But it has to be on her terms and yours." Denise's expression softened, a flicker of hope replacing the initial suspicion. Ammani looked up from the chessboard, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his carefully constructed facade. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that resembled trust. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but in that moment, it felt like the most valuable thing he possessed. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. And in that silence, Franklin knew he had finally found the right move. The light in the sunroom, filtered through the leaded glass, painted the chessboard in kaleidoscopic hues. Franklin watched Ammani, her small hand hovering over a knight, her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd initially envisioned these chess matches as a momentary distraction, a fleeting amusement to punctuate the monotony of his days. Yet, something in her quiet intensity, in the way her dark eyes scanned the board, held him captive. It was a language he understood, the silent conversation of strategy and foresight, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of genuine interest ignited within him. Denise, standing nervously by the doorway, wrung her hands in her apron. Franklin was aware of her apprehension, the unspoken question hanging in the air. He'd offered to support Ammani's burgeoning talent, but the offer felt heavy, laden with the unspoken disparities between their worlds. He cleared his throat. "Denise, I've been thinking." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The weight of his privilege settled in his stomach, a stark contrast to the lightness he'd felt watching Ammani play. Ammani's talent is exceptional. He could see the flicker of hope in Denise's eyes, quickly masked by a practiced caution. "Now, I think maybe it's time to be bold." He looked at Ammani, still lost in her contemplation of the board. "I want her enrolled in the Spring Invitational." Denise's breath hitched. "Mr. Maddox, that's a big tournament." "The cost," her voice trailed off, the unspoken anxieties swirling around them like dust motes in the sunbeams. "Consider it taken care of," Franklin said, his voice firm. The emptiness that had plagued him for so long began to recede, replaced by a nascent purpose. "I believe in her potential." Weeks blurred into a kaleidoscope of training sessions and practice matches. The grand study, once a sanctuary of solitude, now echoed with the quiet click of chess pieces and the rustle of notation pads. Franklin found himself drawn into Ammani's world, captivated by her unwavering focus, the subtle shift in her expression as she calculated her next move. He watched Denise, too, the gradual easing of her tension replaced by a cautious optimism. He recognized the unspoken fear in her eyes, the fear of disappointment, of a world that wasn't always kind to those who dared to dream. The Spring Invitational buzzed with nervous energy. Children, their faces etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, huddled with their coaches, whispering strategies. Ammani, amidst the flurry of activity, remained a still point, her gaze fixed on the board before her. Franklin watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw her analyze, strategize, and execute, her small hand moving with the precision of a seasoned grandmaster. She just won her regional section, a voice said beside him. It was Dr. Ellis, the organizer of the tournament. He looked at Ammani with undisguised admiration. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Franklin felt a surge of pride, unfamiliar and potent. It wasn't just about winning. It was about witnessing the blossoming of a rare talent, a talent he had the privilege to nurture. Later that evening, in the quiet of Denise's modest apartment, the acceptance letter lay on the kitchen table, illuminated by the single overhead bulb. Brown University, a full scholarship. Denise's hands trembled as she reread the words, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Ammani, sitting beside her, traced the university crest with her finger, a faint smile playing on her lips. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Interviews, paperwork, the logistics of relocating. Franklin, immersed in the process, found himself energized in a way he hadn't been in years. He established the Covington Project, a scholarship fund dedicated to supporting young chess players from underprivileged backgrounds. The emptiness he had once carried began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose, a drive to create opportunities for those whose brilliance might otherwise go unnoticed. Back in his study, surrounded by the familiar silence, Franklin looked at the chessboard, the pieces arranged in the final position of his last game with Ammani. He'd lost, of course, but the loss felt like a victory, a testament to the transformative power of connection and the recognition of untapped potential. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool surface of the king, a piece that represented power, strategy, and the ability to shape the game. His gaze drifted to the window, to the world beyond the confines of his estate. The world, he now realized, was full of Ammani's waiting to be discovered, their brilliance shimmering beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to shine. He knew, with unwavering certainty, that his life, once a game played in solitude, had found its true purpose. Sunlight, filtered through the leaded glass of the sunroom, cast kaleidoscopic patterns across the chessboard. 3 months. 3 months since the small, quiet girl had first sat across from him, her gaze steady, her moves precise. Franklin Maddox, a man who had believed himself beyond surprise, found himself repeatedly startled by the echoes of those games. Not by the losses those he'd anticipated, even welcomed in their initial novelty, but by the quiet shift in his own internal landscape. The room, once a testament to his curated solitude, now felt imbued with a strange, unfamiliar energy. He ran a hand over the polished mahogany table, the cool surface a stark contrast to the restless warmth that pulsed beneath his skin. Boredom, that insidious fog that had clung to him for so long, had lifted, replaced by something akin to purpose. The word felt foreign on his tongue, tasting of earnestness he'd long since discarded. He picked up the queen, its ivory weight strangely comforting. Ammani. He'd underestimated her, of course. Not her skill that had been undeniable from the first move, but the depth of her impact. She hadn't asked for his help, his patronage, his carefully constructed rescue. Her silence, initially perceived as shyness, now struck him as something far more profound, an unwavering focus, an innate understanding of her own worth. The memory of her quiet checkmate reverberated, a subtle rebuke to his assumptions. The Covington Project, the name, embossed on the crisp folder in front of him, felt inadequate, almost trivial. It couldn't possibly encapsulate the quiet revolution that had begun within these walls. He'd established a scholarship fund, secured her a place at the prestigious chess academy, arranged for private tutoring with a grandmaster. All necessary, yes, but still insufficient. It felt like building a gilded cage around a bird that was meant to soar. He picked up the pen, the smooth metal cool against his fingers. How to explain the intangible? How to articulate the shift in his own perception, the dismantling of his own carefully constructed worldview? He started to write, the words flowing onto the page with an uncharacteristic urgency. Ammani, he began, the name a silent acknowledgement of the invisible thread that now connected them. I wanted to write to you, not as your sponsor, but as a fellow player, perhaps a student. He paused, a self-deprecating smile playing on his lips. Student, that felt right. He continued, I came to the board seeking an escape from my own ennui. I found, instead, a reflection of my own blindness. The words, stark and honest, hung in the air between them, a silent confession. He thought back to their first game, to his condescending attempts to teach her, to the quiet dignity with which she'd accepted his initial charity. His chest tightened with a belated shame. He wrote on, "You were right. You didn't need saving. You just needed someone to see you." He leaned back, staring out at the manicured lawn, the vast expanse suddenly seeming small, insignificant. He'd spent his life accumulating things, building walls around himself, only to find himself trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. Ammani, in her quiet strength, had shown him the way out. "You've already taught me more than I ever taught you," he finished, the words a quiet testament to her impact. He folded the letter, tucked it into an envelope, the simple act feeling imbued with unexpected weight. He imagined her reading it, her expression unreadable, her mind already strategizing moves far beyond his comprehension. In the quiet intimacy of her small apartment, Ammani carefully unfolded the letter, her fingers smoothing out the creases. The crisp paper felt alien against her worn textbooks. The words, carefully chosen, resonated with a quiet power. She reread the final sentence, a flicker of something akin to amusement dancing in her eyes. He was learning. Good. The game was far from over. Denise, her mother, watched her from the kitchen doorway, a mixture of apprehension and hope etched on her face. "What does Mr. Maddox say?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Ammani looked up, her gaze meeting her mother's. "He says he wants to learn," she replied, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. The city lights, blinking in the distance, reflected in her dark eyes, a silent promise of future moves, future victories. The world, once a confined space, now seemed to stretch out before her, an infinite chessboard waiting to be conquered. The game, she realized, had just begun. And this time, the stakes were higher. This was not just about chess. It was about opportunity, about recognition, about breaking down the walls that confined so many. It was about seeing the potential that bloomed in unexpected places, the brilliance that flickered in the shadows. It was about the quiet revolutions that began in sunrooms and blossomed into movements. It was about asking, not how can we help, but how can we learn? How can we listen? How can we become partners in the game, rather than mere spectators? The answers, like the intricate strategies of chess match, lay waiting to be discovered, one move at a time.